Hello, my name's David Briggs, and I'd like to share a little of the background of my father Linton. Others will speak of his contribution to the apiary industry, but I'd like to share some of the insights that I've gained over the recent years into the kind of person that my father was and what made him tick. For my part, I only really began to understand my father as a younger adult, having spent some time in the world and working with leaders in other community and arts organisations. I began to realise that some of the characteristics of my father were the hallmarks of someone who was very strong in a leadership sense. Slowly at first, I realised that the distanced, incisive and ruthlessly strategic approach to life's questions and challenges were the hallmarks of someone who had a vision of the future and was determined to do what they could to make that a reality. These strengths were held in combination with another group of traits which together formed a remarkable combination. Linton's capacity for compassion, empathy, discretion, and keeping the needs of one's own ego in check. John Linton Briggs was born the third child to Jack and Edith in 1930. Jack and Edith's second child, a girl, died at birth. I don't know at what age he learned of this, but whenever he spoke about it in recent years, it was clear that the loss of that child contributed to Dad's sense of the fragility of our grasp on life, and therefore imbued him with a sense of gratitude for life, not just his own life, but for life in general. Jack Briggs was the officer in charge at the Glenrowan police station from 1926 to 1955, a single officer responsible for a police district of some 1,350 square kilometres on horseback. In those days, the police station also seemed to be something of a one-stop shop for all manner of state government services, from provision of disaster relief following the 1952 bushfires, through to the annual collection of agricultural statistics, all coordinated from the small office and adjoining kitchen of the family home. From a very young age, the Briggs family children came into close and visceral contact with the good, the bad and the ugly of human nature and the inner workings of a small rural community. As Dad often put it, we learn to grow up very quickly. Many of you will be familiar with Dad's reference to the human condition, reflecting his coming to terms with the early experiences of his life. Edith, Dad's mother, in particular, became a very significant positive influence in the life of her children. Unpaid and I dare say officially unrecognised, at least at the time, it was Edith who, while maintaining the security and comfort of her family, provided a great deal of emotional support and probably guidance to those in need, more often than not at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The seeds of a selfless commitment to serve others, to make a positive mark on the world, and to seek to understand and even empathise with those who may seem to be most opposed to your own welfare, were sown in that environment. Born in 1930, Linton was of that generation that emerged into the world in the grip of a Great Depression, and by the time he was 15, the world had gone through the worst horrors mankind had yet seen on a broad scale. Dogged, stoic persistence and an almost desperate resourcefulness were not just attributes, they were a prerequisite to survival. Dad was one of those people endowed with an abundance of natural abilities, a skillful command of language, a gifted draftsman, a fine bass baritone singing voice, coupled with a daunting work ethic. And yet, in many ways, Dad did not possess a great deal of self-confidence. But somewhat paradoxically, he did possess an unflinching preparedness to back his own convictions. A very early example of this very nearly brought him undone before he barely started. At an early age, pre-teen I think, having mastered the principles of flight, building numerous gliders and model aircraft, he decided to take to the skies himself, built himself a prototype hang glider, and without further ado launched himself from the apex of the stable roof behind the police station in Glenrowan. Probably, his craft did slow his descent sufficiently that he was not irreparably damaged, but he learned a valuable lesson. In latter years, this willingness to take calculated risks was more refined and resulted in less bodily harm. As an adolescent and young adult, Linton was at the height of his powers as far as physical activities were concerned. And for a time, fishing, hunting, playing cricket, football and softball were enough. By his own account, he did not really recognise any more meaningful ambitions through those years. But already his association with beekeeping had been formed, and when appointed Secretary of the Glenrowan Recreation Reserve at the age of 19, a position which he held for 66 years, it didn't take long for him to realise that he had a great and rewarding capacity to work with people and indeed to provide leadership as a member of a group. It was only a matter of time before this translated into his involvement in apiary industry associations. When talking about beekeeping, one of Dad's most often repeated points was on the egalitarian nature of keeping bees and an interest in bees. That no matter what walk of life, culture or class one came from, an interest in bees puts us all on the same level. You could travel anywhere in the world and within a half a day of landing in a country, have your feet under the table of a kindred spirit, sharing your passion and interest for bees. That's a quote I've heard repeated by several industry members. There is so much that could be said, but I think that the tributes heard here from some of the people he most admired and respected pretty adequately sum up the important themes of Linton's contribution and point to a lasting legacy for the craft of beekeeping. Finally, I would like to thank everyone who has applied themselves to this project, and in particular, I'd like to acknowledge the time and effort of Fiona Chambers in seeing this project through to completion. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Bill Sykes and I'm your MC for today's tribute to Linton Briggs. We had hoped to have this presentation live at Beechworth in North East Victoria, but COVID-19 restrictions have frustrated that. Linton was clearly a fine man who made an enormous contribution to his community and to the bee industry. Linton could well be crowned the King Bee. We'll now move on to a presentation by Jodie Goldsworthy, a noted bee industry person who makes an enormous contribution both nationally and internationally in the bee industry. If Linton was crowned the King Bee, then Jodie could well be crowned the Queen Bee.
If bees are nature's gift to the world, then our dear friend and mentor, Linton Briggs AM, was nature's gift to the Australian beekeeping industry, to bees and to their essential floral resources. I have been so fortunate to have known Linton for as long as I can remember having anything to do with bees. My family sourced our queen bee cells from Linton, and my first memory of Linton was visiting with my dad to Glenrowan to pick up the queen cells. Dad loved to talk, and so did Linton, and I recall fondly many trips and the waiting along the driveway amongst the nucleus hives for Linton and Dad to swap stories. Linton was one of those special adults to take an interest in you when you were a child. He spoke genuinely to you and mesmerised and intrigued you with his special way. I remember also as a child the role that Linton played in the Patterson's Curse issue, and even then his leadership and wisdom was really obvious. I recall my dad spending long phone calls to Linton about the Patterson's Curse topic. Each time he'd get off the phone and speak to my mum about what Linton had said. And Dad always ended that conversation with my mum by saying just how lucky we were to have Linton there looking out for us beekeepers. As a young female building a business in the Australian honey industry, I soon found Linton to be ever so generous with his guidance and support. I could count on Linton to provide a context, a history, a view, or a perspective on something that I was still learning or trying to fathom. And I found myself more and more in the advocacy and leadership circles of our industry. I then found Linton to be such a wise and willing mentor. I learnt much from his dedication and his leadership style, and have always said that if I could master just some of Linton's approaches, his patience and his tactics, then I would be all the better for having done so. I was so privileged to spend time with Linton, travelling to and from Ween Bee Foundation meetings in later years. His thoughtfulness and ability to analyse what he referred to as the human condition always helped me to understand, respect more, and work better with the diversity of views and backgrounds in our industry. Linton taught me through his quiet conversations and recounts of what had gone before me, how to harness the best aspects of people and to grow and build a better future for our industry. I miss you often, Linton, and I'm so grateful for your investment in me and in others. Can I also close by saying a massive thank you to Helen and the Briggs family for their gift to the Australian beekeeping industry through their permanent loan of Linton to his fellow beekeepers for more than 70 years. The Briggs family were the backup team that supported and allowed Linton to use the gift that he was given. Thank you so much.
My name is Max Whitten and I'm chairman of the Ween Bee Foundation, and it for me is a great honour to be able to talk about a great friend, Linton Briggs. And as you go through life you have the opportunity to meet lots of great people, and people that have got high intellect, great integrity, they're able to speak well, they're able to write well, they tick all the boxes for being great people. And if you have a room full of these great people, sometimes one even stands out amongst those, and that's Linton. Linton was a leader amongst leaders. And what I'd like to do is just give a couple of examples to show why Linton was a really special person, really great for his family, great for the bee industry, and great for agriculture. And the first of those stories goes back to the mid-1970s. And in the 1970s, I was a professor of genetics at Melbourne University. I was working on the sheep blowfly. I actually had bees on top of the genetics building in Parkville. And when I met with Linton, he shared those interests because he had sheep, and sheep blowfly strike was a problem for him. He of course was a leading beekeeper. He had a great interest in genetics and in stock improvement. And the other thing we had in common was Gretchen Ween. Gretchen Ween was a friend for both Linton and me, and Gretchen of course, who was the originator of the foundation. Gretchen, a great queen breeder and greatly interested in stock improvement. Now, one of the problems for stock improvement in Australia was you could not actually bring bees into Australia easily. So the first project that the three of us got involved in was the establishment of the quarantine facility at Eastern Creek in Sydney. Everyone told us it was a waste of time, it wouldn't happen. Well, Linton, Gretchen, myself, and there were others, we put the case together to the Commonwealth Government, and they agreed to build the quarantine facility. And that quarantine facility at Eastern Creek provided access for beekeepers to bring in bees for stock improvement from the 1980s till just after 2000. And in 2000, that facility was going to close down, and a new facility had to be built. At the end of the day, that facility was built at Mickleham, now near Melbourne. It turned out that the technology for that facility was the same as in Sydney, and I was able to persuade the government to use that blueprint for the new facility. Now, who had the blueprint? It was Linton. Linton was a great storer of information, of records. Linton was able to provide the blueprint, which is now the facility down at Mickleham. And that's an example of how Linton was just able to do things, just create great outcomes. So that's in the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, I went back to CSIRO as a chief of the Division of Entomology. But I was also, at the same time, chairman of the Honeybee R&D Council. And also at the same time, I was a recipient of an injunction from two beekeepers and two graziers to stop biological control of Patterson's curse. And so here was Linton and me, this time on opposite sides of the fence. He was the guy serving the injunction, I was the recipient of the injunction, but I was also chairman of the Honeybee R&D Council. And we got together with a group of lawyers, and the upshot of it was we actually created the Biological Control Act. That Biological Control Act actually took away from the beekeepers and the graziers the ability to stop us going ahead with the biological control. But we also built into the legislation that the beekeepers could be compensated. And when John Kieran took it through Parliament, at the end of the debate, John Kieran said, "This is the most informed, the most bipartisan debate I've ever seen in the Parliament." And in many ways that was a tribute to Linton. Because of his leadership, we were able to actually do something which solved the problem. We were able to go ahead with the biological control, and if there was a loss for beekeepers, they could be compensated. So there's another example of Linton's ability, and he played a major central role. A bit later, I had to put up a case for Linton to get an Order of Australia. And I was able to say that Linton, because I mixed it with leaders in the grains industry, the dairy industry, the wool, the meat, and Linton was equal to all those leaders in all those other industries. And so the beekeeping industry had a fantastic leader who was equal to it, indeed even better than a lot of those other leaders. So that's the second story. The third one, I got caught up with Linton and Gretchen to put forward a case for why the beekeeping industry should be supported further. And in the course of that, it turns out that Gretchen had made a will for leaving her estate to the beekeeping industry. And when we talked to Gretchen about it, it was Linton and I talking with Gretchen, we agreed that rather than wait till Gretchen passed away, this was in 2009, we would sort of create a living legacy of Gretchen's estate, and we set up the Ween Bee Foundation. And that gave Gretchen a new lease of life. She was suffering badly. She had shrunk about 6 inches because her spine was collapsing on her. And Linton and I were then the executors of the estate. We were the foundation directors of the Ween Bee Foundation with Gretchen and with her accountant, Colin Powell. And so the four of us set up this foundation, and it was a living legacy, and it gave Gretchen an extra reason to live. It was just fantastic. And as a result of it, we have this fabulous Ween Bee Foundation, and of course I'm really sad to say that we no longer have Linton with us, but we have some fabulous other directors, and I'm sure that Linton will be looking down there and saying this is a fantastic outcome. And I think they're just 3 little examples of the odd 50 years that Linton and I were friends, and how he did so much for the beekeeping industry, agriculture generally, and of course his family in Glenrowan. And I think I can finally say that I had the privilege a couple of weeks before Linton passed away to actually go and see him, and his wife Helen was there in hospital, and it was such a precious moment for me to be able to say goodbye, Linton.
Loris and I are grateful for the opportunity to share a little of our experiences with Linton, a very special person in our lives. By 1979, Linton was well established as an industry leader. We were aware of his involvement in the establishment of the Hastings Caucasian bees in Australia, his leadership of field days in northeastern Victoria, and his presidency of the FCAAA. Our early commitment to the industry organisation was curtailed in 1969 as the enormous growth of urban population in southeast Queensland saw the destruction of most beekeeping flora around Brisbane. It was at the 1979 Queensland Beekeepers Association conference in Rockhampton that we became more aware of Linton Briggs. Tim Smith, Capilano Honey, put a proposal before the conference to strengthen the role of the FCAAA by introducing a voluntary 0.5 cent per kilogram levy on honey sales to fund a part-time executive officer position combined with the role of president, then held by Linton. I became Warwick branch president in 1980 and QBA president in 1983. Linton and Max Whitten were leaders of an industry workshop held at Hawkesbury Agricultural College, at which major industry issues were discussed and recommendations for future industry pathways proposed. I attended this workshop. I also attended my first FCAAA meeting in Lakes Entrance, and our family stayed a night with Linton and Helen at Glenrowan. An Industries Assistance Commission hearing into the beekeeping / honey industry was held, and Linton travelled to Brisbane to attend. During this hearing we shared a room in the then Canberra Hotel and watched on the television the final race of the America's Cup, which was won by Australia too.
They're about to cross the line. They make a final move.
I can still hear Linton's hearty chortle of delight. These reasonably close contacts provided opportunity for mutual understanding to develop. In 1986 I was elected FCAAA president. At the Hawkesbury workshop, honeybee improvement was a major topic, and the Honey Research Committee of that time had approved funding for a program in both Eastern and Western Australia. Gretchen Ween had trained in artificial insemination and lived at Richmond, close to Hawkesbury Agricultural College, and one of my first assignments with Linton was to progress negotiations with senior college staff to have the college as the headquarters of the Eastern States bee breeding program. Of course, during my 3 years as FCAAA president, we were involved together in various deputations and meetings on behalf of the industry. In 1987, a detailed policy document on honeybees and conserved forests was prepared, and in 1988 the FCAAA prepared for and conducted the Second Australian Bee Congress. Linton, at all times, prepared appropriate and well-articulated submissions and provided well-respected leadership for our industry. As well, he found opportunities to exercise his well-honed sense of humour and his artistic abilities, sketching caricatures of attendees at meetings from time to time. In 1992, the FCAAA met in Bundaberg, and we had a short holiday together on Lady Elliot Island, where a significant part of Linton's time was spent writing his post-annual meeting correspondence. 1993 saw the end of the Hawkesbury breeding program approaching, and a number of prominent industry participants, including Linton and I, formed a consortium to purchase representations of each line of queen bees to continue the improvement program and provide breeder queens to the industry. Linton at all times represented the industry with the highest level of integrity and expertise, to the great advantage of the industry as a whole. His wholehearted service has been acknowledged with numerous accolades, including life membership and his award as a member of the Order of Australia. Gladly, Linton and I agreed on most things, which helped us form a very harmonious relationship. Loris and I appreciate very much our friendship with Linton and Helen, and hold Linton in the highest esteem.
Linton was one of nature's gentlemen, so it makes sense that he worked with nature all of his life. Linton was also a very effective negotiator and advocate for causes that he believed in. In relation to the bee industry, Linton sought my help to gain fair access to native forests for the bee industry. Linton had the facts at his fingertips, and he argued persistently and logically, and I believe the outcome that we're able to achieve was to the benefit of all bee industry members and the public in general.
Firstly, thank you to the Briggs family for the privilege of speaking about my friend and colleague, and also to everyone for organising today so we can honour the life of Linton Briggs and the enormous contribution Linton has made to the Australian beekeeping industry over several decades. It is difficult to comprehend that one person can contribute so much to an industry. So many of our industry's documents and policies have Linton's thoughts and words enshrined in their content. Linton's guiding influence and wise counsel has had a profound influence on the outcome of an extraordinary number of meetings. Many of our industry's delegations to department leaders and numerous ministerial delegations would have had a different outcome without Linton's guidance and wise counsel. Linton and I represented the industry together on many occasions. It would be fair to say we knew each other's spots. How often did you hear that term? I always look forward to working with Linton because I always had the utmost confidence. He had read every word in a document, analysed every paragraph, and given due consideration to the total content, something I respected greatly. On one such occasion, Linton and I were representing the industry at the very first of the regional forest agreements to be implemented across Australia. It was a very difficult process. People were fundamentally opposed with different interests and objectives. It was not a friendly environment, but Linton's skills shone through. Many years later, we were in Melbourne drafting what was to become the new policy document for beekeeping on public land in Victoria. We had developed a plan to create resource security for all public land bee sites, a sound position with an objective of minimising the loss of vital floral resources that underpin the viability of the honeybee and honeybee pollination dependent industries. We glanced at each other as we thought we were going to plan when the chairman promptly shut us down, saying that we would have to take this issue up in another forum. We were stunned. With that, Linton sat bolt upright in his chair and with some authority hit the table with his hand and said, "We sure will, and we will not give up." You could have heard a pin drop. No one spoke a word, but everyone had a clear understanding as to Linton's thoughts on what had just transpired. Right up to Linton's passing, he was still advocating for equitable coexistence and usage of these public land resources. A fair go for the men and women of this industry, but also with the broad understanding of the value of these public land assets are to food security and ultimately humanity. One of Linton's great passions was for the natural environment. His understanding of how these ecosystems functioned, the location of certain species, elevation and soil types to where they evolved was extraordinary. His knowledge over such a long period, from his early days hiking in the mountains trout fishing, to understanding all the honeybee floral resources for his queen rearing business. Linton freely shared this knowledge with so many of us that there would be not too many, directly or indirectly, that haven't learnt from Linton. I am sure botanists could have learnt something from Linton, such were his skills. Linton's guiding influence and wise counsel has also assisted so many people in our industry achieve significantly more in public life, myself included. As to observe Linton in action, one could learn so much. One particular aspect I learned from Linton was always write for a broader audience and other eyes, he would often say. Linton had been blessed with a wonderful gift and delivered this gift in an exemplary manner. We shared accommodation on numerous occasions. The late nights. Robin would often book an apartment for us and Linton. We would always then discuss the next day's agenda and plan until all hours. Robin was well and truly in bed by this time, leaving us with plenty of biscuits and cake. And if the cricket was on in England, the Ashes in particular, well, the nights turned into mornings as a ball-by-ball commentary was shared. One morning I said to Linton, if we don't go to bed soon, we could order breakfast, and that would save us the trouble of making our beds. You can imagine the laughter. On a very personal note, thank you sincerely, Linton, for all your guidance and assistance over many years. I am a fortunate person to have met and worked with you, and of course, all the chats at all hours, which I miss greatly, about bees, trees, trout, football, and the greatest game of all, cricket. Thank you again to the Briggs family for this privilege today of honouring the life of Linton.
I am of course very happy and honoured to record this tribute to Linton. Everybody I think has had a few amazing mentors in their life. I want to acknowledge Linton Briggs as a great mentor of mine, the famous queen breeder from Glenrowan in Victoria. So I think the first time that I met Linton was in 1984 when I was 23, and that was at the Standing Committee on Agriculture workshop that was held at Hawkesbury College. I think at that time Linton was about the age I am now, which is 62, and I was about 21 or 22. That's quite an age difference, but nevertheless we got on really well, I thought. At the same time, Linton was also Secretary of the Federal Council of Australian Apiarists Associations, which was the forerunner of ARBIC. And you have to think back that instead of being run from a plush office in Sydney with at least some remuneration, the FCAAA at the time was run out of Linton and Helen's house in Glenrowan, and I think with no remuneration, just expenses. And Linton would write out the minutes and reports in his stylish longhand, and Helen would type them up on a typewriter, and then photocopies would be made and stuffed into fat envelopes and mailed to everybody who was interested in industry affairs across Australia. And sometimes I remember Linton would enhance his reports with a little cartoon or a little drawing or something like that. He was really quite an artist. He was a ball of energy at that time. He would knock on politicians' doors and make himself known to all the major public servants in Victoria and across the nation. He and I got into a lot of fights, and I don't mean between us, but with the broader world. And I'll mention just two. The first was the fight about the biological control of Patterson's curse. Before my time, the FCAAA had successfully achieved a legal injunction preventing the CSIRO from releasing biological control agents to control Echium, as Patterson's curse is scientifically known. And there was an Industries Assistance Commission inquiry into this to see whether this should be reversed, what the net benefit to Australia would be if the biological control agents were released. And Linton and I made lengthy submissions independently in this case, but of course with some cooperation. And I recall that the Commission recognised the economic impact of the control of Patterson's curse on beekeepers, but nonetheless they still thought that on balance the release of the biological control agents should go ahead. But the injunction restraining CSIRO remained, and the biological control agents were not released despite the IAC's recommendation. However, in 1988, I learned that the Victorian Department of Conservation and Land Management was secretly planning to release the CSIRO's beetles and borers. So I had a little word in Linton's ear, off the record of course, and Linton started digging and found out, yes indeed, the rumours were true, but it was too late and the beetles had flown. Another thing that Linton and I worked on for many years was this problem of exclusion of bees and beekeepers from national parks. At his instigation, we prepared a discussion paper and a position paper that summarised all the scientific studies on the effect of bees on the environment. The problem was that at that time, most land managers and politicians had formed the opinion that bees were exotic animals and had no place in national parks. So what was the position that the industry should take? And the position that Linton and I came up with was that the industry acknowledged there must be some competition between honeybees and native organisms. Of course there is. If you've got a bee colony living in a hollow, a possum can't live in that hollow, so there must be some effect. But our position was that commercial bees place no additional burdens on the environment given the huge feral population. This is quite a nuanced argument and quite difficult to sell to beekeepers. And a few of them were quite opposed to it. They wanted us to take a much more hardline view that bees have no effect on the environment and probably beneficial. Anyway, in the end, Linton and I prevailed, and that's been the industry's position ever since. During this time, I formed the view that research on feral bees was sorely needed. So what we needed to know was whether there really was a huge feral population, as we were arguing, and whether it was self-sustaining, as we were also arguing. So to answer this question, I set up a major ecological study in Wyperfeld National Park, which is south of North Europe, and that involved marking individually with a tag 2,000 red gum and black box trees. And we visited these 4 times a year for 5 years, recording all the colonies and their births and their deaths, etc., etc. What did we find out? Yes, indeed, the population is huge, up to 160 colonies per square kilometre, and yes, it is self-sustaining. It was a great study, and it still contributes to debates about access. Now, I just want to finish with a few thoughts about Linton the person. So he's a real gentleman, as I'm sure most of you know who met him. He never had a bad word about anybody. Okay, sometimes he could be disappointed in somebody, but he would never come out and say he was cross with him. He was a religious guy in a way that I'm not, but like our age difference, I don't think that ever came between us. He was always immaculately dressed, never without polished shoes and a perfectly knotted tie, which I later learned he drew from a collection of clip-ons, and hence they always had the perfect knots. Anyway, I'm sure that you'll all agree that it was a privilege to know Linton. He was a tireless and selfless worker for the industry, very sharp intellect, great judge of people. Vale Linton Briggs.
Thanks, Ben. Vale Linton Briggs indeed. As CEO of the Ween Bee Foundation, I had the honour and privilege to work alongside Linton from 2016 until his passing in 2020. Over those years, I lost count of the number of beekeepers I met who proudly told me, Linton Briggs is my mentor. We've heard repeatedly from others today how Linton was a giant among men, a true gentleman, a friend, a colleague and a teacher. He was clearly admired and revered by so many people. When I think of Linton, the word that always comes to my mind is gracious. Linton was always courteous, he was kind and he was pleasant. But alongside that, he was a man of great courage, conviction and determination. There was always a presence about Linton. He had the ability to raise people up to be the best they could be. And like the many beekeepers I have met, I feel so proud to be amongst you when I say Linton Briggs was my mentor too. It's therefore my very great pleasure and privilege to announce on behalf of the Ween Bee Foundation Board the establishment of the Linton Briggs Advancing Apiculture Fund. After Linton's passing, the board reflected on the most appropriate way to honour Linton's life, and we reflected on the legacy that he left. It was Linton's enduring commitment to encouraging, supporting, and mentoring others that stood out as his hallmark. The Linton Briggs Advancing Apiculture Fund will grow the skills and capacity of Australian beekeepers. The fund will stand as a lasting legacy in memory of the remarkable and much-loved man who was Linton Briggs. If you would like to join Ween Bee Foundation in honouring Linton Briggs, we invite you to make a contribution to the Linton Briggs Advancing Apiculture Fund via the Ween Bee Foundation website or by contacting me directly for more information.
In closing, I'd like to again thank the speakers for their insights to their times with Linton Briggs, and thank you all for viewing this video. Clearly, Linton was a fine man, and the world is a better place for Linton having walked this earth. May he rest in peace.